And so with that being said, as Josh mentioned, we have two albums from 1962. So chronologically, they're basically around the same time. So we're going to go with the old axiom of ladies first, and we are going to do Patsy Cline first. So I guess now would be a good time for a little bit of a bio
Hmm.
on Patsy Cline. She was part of a movement within Nashville of country music that also kind of crossed over to the mainstream. So imagine country music. And we still see this to this day, right? You know, if we go to the 90s, right, you have like Shania Twain and Faith Hill. You know, in the 70s, we had Dolly Parton and Loretta Lynn and, Carrie Underwood. There's just a steady stream. Casey Musgraves now, right? A steady
Even
stream of, yeah.
even like Taylor Swift, right? She started out
Oh yeah,
country.
absolutely. Taylor
Yeah.
Swift for sure. And we're just going with female. There's a male lineage of this too.
Yeah.
Although the female seems to be, you see it more often. You don't see too many male country singers become pop staples.
Hmm.
Like you think like Billy Ray Cyrus had the one track, but when Garth Brooks tried to do it, right, it didn't kind of. And even people that you know the name of, like Tim McGraw or Kenny Chesney or Keith Urban, right?
Yep.
They really don't cross over to the mainstream since at least the 70s, I'd say. And I don't know why that is, why the women have more success becoming sort of more mainstream pop stars. Do you have any theories on that?
Yeah, that's a good question. I feel like there's something inviting about these types of female artists when in their singing. Maybe that makes it more accessible in some way.
Yeah, I would be curious if anybody is familiar with that phenomenon and sort of the Nashville machine as to why it seems to be, I shouldn't say singularly because there's exceptions, but why the men seem to stay in that genre or become niche artists, like a Sturgill Simpson or something where
Mm.
they cross into the world of alternative music, right? But they don't become pop, right?
Yeah.
Or mainstream. So in a way
I think
that we
Garth
just
Brooks is a pretty good example of somebody being mainstream. He was pretty big in the
but
90s.
like I grew up in New Jersey, right? And
Yeah.
you would never hear Garth Brooks on the
Oh,
radio
really? Okay.
unless you went to a country station,
Mm.
of which I think there might have been one near me.
Yeah.
But in the same area where I'm from, you would have heard Faith Hill, you would have heard Taylor Swift now, right? You would have
Yeah.
heard Shania Twain, you would have heard them all on the pop radio station.
Yeah.
Does that make sense? Kind of what
Hmm.
I'm saying? And
Yeah,
yes,
yeah.
I knew Garth Brooks was a huge deal, but he operated in like another. He might as well have been Miles Davis,
Yeah.
right? In terms of like,
Right.
I know he's huge, but he doesn't exist in popular. And that's where I'm sure maybe in other areas where country's bigger, he crossed over to pop music. And I it sounds like you had a different experience.
Yeah, I don't. Yeah, I just remember him. Well, growing up in uh, Virginia, North Carolina, Texas, probably heard more country, just in the air than maybe you did.
Yeah, but were you hearing Garth Brooks, for example, on the same stations that you were hearing Michael Jackson or Prince or stuff like? Because you in the right, I was hearing Shania Twain in the same places I was
Yeah,
hearing the
yeah,
Backstreet Boys, right?
right,
But I don't
right.
think I ever heard the
No,
equivalent. Yeah.
yeah, you're probably right. It's probably segregated in that way.
Well, anyway, where all that was coming from is in the early 60s, there were a lot of artists that were crossing over with a countryish sound, a country pop sound, right? And
Hmm.
they mentioned Brenda Lee, who we have not covered yet, was a star in the same era, actually shared the same producer as Patsy Cline. In the 50s, there was an artist named Kitty Wells who had done the same. And she was part of that, bringing country torch songs, I think, to the mainstream, would be
Yeah.
the best way to put it. So she actually began recording in the 1950s, and she recorded particularly between 1955 and 1960. And I'd like to, because we're doing a shorter bio, these bios are more a couple sites, a little bit of all music, a little bit of Wikipedia, a little bit of just resources there. So it is not a deep dive, but
Hmm.
in 55 through 60, she's releasing singles. I think I saw that it was 17 in total, but only one of them was considered a hit. That song was Walking After Midnight, and it actually got to the top 20 on the pop charts. So she had crossed over on that one, but it was kind of entering sort of one-hit wonder territory, right? Pretty much everybody, though, says that the 1950s music that she recorded sounds extremely different than the early 1960s hits. So it's kind of like two artists, is how it's described
Okay.
often. That there's rockabilly elements, there's gospel elements in the 50s stuff. Like most artists from that era, she had a terrible record contract
Yep.
that she kind of had limits in terms of who she could sing songs from and stuff like that. I'm sure financially it was a terrible deal. But she just sort of was kind of stuck in gear in 1960, and then she just decides in 1960, when her initial record contract expires, to work with a gentleman named Owen Bradley, and they
Hmm.
began to be able to select from a greater range of material. And a lot of people say that sort of that material fit her voice better, and that was sort of the catalyst for her breaking out. And the first song she did was I Fall to Pieces, which got to number 12 on the pop charts and number one on the country charts. So she's already doing it there. And a lot of people credit that song with sort of setting the blueprint for what Nashville country sounded like. The strings, right? The backup guitar,
Yep.
the lushness, right? And the poppiness.
Yep.
And that kind of was her template. And she continues to record. There's a couple albums, of which this is one that comes a little later in this run of we're doing Sentimentally Yours tonight. So this is actually her last studio album of her career. Because one thing that obviously is a part of the story, sadly, is that she had a severe auto accident in 1961. After that, though, she did some of her biggest work, like Crazy, right? Probably the song most
Yep.
people associate her with, which actually is not on the album we're
Hmm.
doing tonight. But she's getting songs from all kinds of different young songwriters, probably most famously Willie Nelson, who actually wrote Crazy, which is something I did not know
Oh, I
along the
didn't know
way.
that either. Hmm.
Yep, and so she's 30 years old in 1963. While she's still pretty hot as an artist. She's dipping a little bit, but still was a really well-known singer, kind of entering that next phase. But unfortunately, at the age of 30 in March of 1963, she passed away tragically in a plane crash. And as a result, she has joined that pantheon of artists, right, who are sort of
Yep.
taken in what would be considered to be their prime or close to their prime. And as such, you take her trailblazing stuff to begin with that we just talked about, and you throw in obviously that twinge of what could have been, and you have sort of Patsy Cline's legacy. So
Yep.
I think that's probably as good a place for us to stop as any for the bio. There's a lot more.
Well, I'd
That's
like
in
to add one thing
Sure.
to tie it into the '80s decade that we talked about when we discussed Katie Lang's Shadowland. That which we all I think felt very highly on. That album was actually produced by Owen Bradley and had Kitty Wells and Brenda Lee and Loretta Lynn on one of the Honky Tonk Angels medley track. So that album is very indebted to this classic country period, and I'm sure if Patsy Cline had still been alive, she would have been on Katie Lang's album as well.
Absolutely. And I think I even remember us saying it's a shame we're not covering Patsy Cline to kind of do a compare and contrast. And life sometimes has a way of bringing you back to your initial thoughts.
Yep.
And so now we are doing Patsy Cline Sentimentally Yours. So, okay, enough table setting there. Josh, what'd you think of this one?
Yeah, I really enjoyed this album. You know, it's so rare that I listen to classic country albums. You know, most of that has been from the show that we've done, and there's such an inviting sound to this type of work. I mean, most of these are considered country standards, I guess you would say, and there's something so familiar and warm about these types of songs. You know, they're covered over and over by different artists, and I think Hank Williams was a writer on some of these albums or songs as well. That and I don't know if he performed them originally, but these point being is these songs have been performed over and over again, and Patsy Cline puts her spin on them. And I'm not saying I'm super familiar with these tracks outside of her, but there's just a, a familiarity that I'm sure she has with these songs, um, and a warm feeling when I'm listening to this album. The other big point is that her voice is so great, and she has such a you know unfiltered sound to her voice. You really get the sense that she's a strong singer, that she like some of these other artists that we've talked about, like Katie Lang, really, that she has a distinct style to her voice. There's a strength there, and I feel like that's missing in a lot of modern artists. You don't know what their actual voice is, or there's a lot of production that can hide imperfections. And then when somebody does stand out, like I guess like Lady Gaga or somebody or Kelly Clarkson, that has a really strong voice, you notice it more. And I feel like those artists back then were less produced, but it allowed them to highlight where their talent lied and their voice. And I feel like that's what I got from listening to this, is just kind of an appreciation for her voice. The getting more to the production side of things, I feel like, again, it's like artists at the top of their game with the harmonies and the strings and all of the backing vocals. Everything's kind of carefully constructed, and it really creates a warm sound throughout, not just her voice, but through the music as well. And it's just really well done. I feel like, I don't know if artists or production companies did it better then, but they certainly knew how to highlight their lead singer while also providing a solid foundation where you can hear all the instruments and kind of appreciate what they put together.
Well, probably because the gateway to being an artist in this era, because there weren't as many production tricks, still was, can you sing?
Yeah.
So, as a result, it's like you could tell much quicker if somebody couldn't sing, right?
Yeah.
And there weren't a lot of things they could do to embellish it. And what I'd like to add, Josh, I think you were right around the corner of it, that I wrote down, is there's an authenticity to her voice. It's
good word. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's hard to describe. She's undeniably a great singer, but she's not a powerhouse in the way that some singers are, right? And she's not so distinctive that you immediately are like, oh my gosh, right off the bat. Like, you can recognize her if you listen to her, but there's other folks doing this lane. It's just sort of the way that she sings just makes you, even these pretty standard, what I call torch songs, right? Like holding a torch for the same type of stuff that they're recording in Motown later in the decade, right? These songs could have just as easily been sung by, the Supremes as they are her, right? Kind of in terms of what
and all the doo-wop and kind of early rock and roll too.
It sounds like the late 50s, early 60s production. We've talked about 70s production and mid 80s production. This is the early 60s production, and we'll see it again in the album we're covering next. But it's that sort of they mentioned in what I said in the bio there, that lush orchestral sort of sound, right? It builds up. It's almost derivative from like the standards, like people singing the standards. It's still there, but it's become more poppy and not as slow. Sometimes they speed it up a little bit. Sometimes they add a little bit more catchiness, like Return to the Hook type of deal. That's a staple of pop. But I look at this era of music to some degree as we're not quite yet at the people that are expanding the conventions yet. I think that's coming probably more like mid 60s, right? Where you're going stuff. And as much as music is being expanded, I don't know if pop music is where it's being expanded quite yet. It might be the worlds of jazz and some other areas where I heard more pushing of boundaries.
Right.
In this era, to me, pop music still comes down to two things: how catchy is your song and how good is your singer, right? And while this one didn't have as many catchy songs, I'd say, you had the singer portion of it.
Yep.
And that's why I enjoyed this album. It suffers a little bit from being one note for me in terms of song. I would have liked to have seen maybe taking on some different topics in the way that we saw with Loretta Lynn later, right? Or the humor, right? That came from like a Dolly Parton later. This one is still, and you know, it's of the era, so I don't mean to knock it. This is what people wanted, right? They wanted love songs, broken
Yep.
heart songs, the joy of love songs. So
Unrequited love, yeah.
right, and
Lost love, etc. Yeah.
correct, and you can't help but think that, you know, as the '60s progressed, Patsy Cline would have evolved with the '60s,
Yep.
you know, and kind of sang about more nuanced stuff, and we would have gotten a little bit more of who Patsy Cline is, as opposed to stage managed is the wrong word, but you know what I mean? Like, kind of everybody back then was sort of felt like more of a product in some way. It's
Yep.
funny because in some ways it was more authentic because you could connect with the artists and you just felt like you knew them more, warts and all. But also there was a distance that you had, and some of it's what the world was. Communication traveled slower. People weren't as in photos and stuff. You kind of had to really gather your info from certain sources, right? And if you were a
Mhm.
person that wasn't out there putting yourself, you know, in the world, you sort of just, you were just a voice to some degree, you know what I mean? And
Yep.
and that's not a bad thing, but that's how I felt this album was. The standouts for me on this one, my favorite song on this album was Strange. I think that was
Mine too.
yep.
Yeah.
Okay, good.
Yeah.
So we're there. I think the song that you would know, if you were not as familiar with Patsy Cline, is going to be Your Cheatin' Heart, which has been covered
Yep.
a zillion times. She's Got You is probably another one that a fair amount of people would know, I think. But yeah, to me, the combo of Strange and You Belong to Me is probably the highlight of the album. That's tracks 7 and 8 in a
Yeah,
12-track
we're really
album.
in lockstep. That's what I noted as well. Those two
Okay.
back to back. Yep.
Wow. So we were hearing this album the same way, which is good. So I'm guessing that probably both of us are going to end up in the same place, which is for me, it's going to be slight thumbs up. The slight not being a slight of the album, the slight being more of a function of, to go to true thumbs up for me, I do believe you kind of either have to push the genre a little bit and or have something that stands out at like a level where you're willing to forgive it, right? Something so identifiable. And while Patsy Cline has a great voice, I don't know if the material here serves her all the way, right? With what I feel could be extracted out of her. But still an easy listen. No complaints from me at all.
Yeah, yeah, none for me either. I think all of the songs that we've talked about, I would say, display, primarily the greatness of her voice, the power there, and she's got some range too. She hits some high notes. She, works in concert with the backing harmonies, and I would also say that this album sounds great on headphones. I don't know if they remastered it or what, but you get different parts of the orchestra in different ears at times, like on Strange, and you can really hear everything, which I really appreciated.
No, I listened on Spotify, which does not have a remastered copy, which means that it would have to be mono, right? At
Yeah.
this age, because stereo's not coming to the late '60s. So,
Right.
and when mono's coming, it's coming at you in one stream, right? And once again, that benefits when something just sonically stands out.
Yeah.
And in this case, that's her voice. So,
Yeah. I feel like a more, and I'm just pulling this out of thin air, but somebody like Linda Ronstadt is probably indebted to Patsy Cline. If Patsy Cline had lived longer, I feel like she might have had the same type of career that
so
Linda Ronstadt did.
it's so funny you say that because I wrote that note, but not about
Really?
this segment. So yeah, we'll revisit that theme right there. But yeah, she's another one that kind of combined, well, I guess the Western, right? The country Western, right? The Western sounds into her career, but as a undeniable pop star, right?
Yeah, she made that transition in some ways, or was able to cross over and go into both areas.
Well, and to some degree, Patsy Cline did too, because she was charting on the pop charts. And
Yeah.
you could hear it because she doesn't sound so much country that for someone who the twang is a boundary for them, right?
Yep.
I would imagine this could play across the country, even in a more regionalized America that was 1962. I also think it could travel overseas a little easier than maybe true twang country, which might sound, too American, right? Too Southern American, right? To someone.
Yeah, I wonder how much this, we spoke about those French albums last week, and I wonder if this got over to the French country, and and how much
Well,
that
this is the same time
contributed. Yeah,
as that
right.
Francois Hardy album that we covered last
Yep.
week. So, yeah, interesting.
Yeah.
So,
Thumbs up for me also. I would have, like you said, I would have liked, while she is very authentic on this album, I would have liked to, what was her personality like, and, what else would she have liked to be interested in singing in, and what could have been, would have upped this album to me a bit more.
well, and I think of her as being from deeper in the South than Winchester, Virginia, but then I have to remember the Virginia of 1962 is a very different place than the Virginia of now.
Yeah,
So
that
it
was-
could have been what I perceived, just not now.
Yeah, and as someone who's been through and in Winchester, Virginia many times, I wish I had known. I would have gone to see her graver. It's
Well,
yes,
it's probably she died in Camden, Tennessee, so it's probably in Tennessee, but you could see her birthplace.
no.
would
I
be
think Wikipedia said she's buried in Winchester.
Oh, she is buried. Okay, so
Yeah.
so she did maintain ties. That's
Yep.
cool. Okay.
So yeah. So hi. We were both positive on this album. Sounds like. Yep.
For sure.